Welcome back to the Lubar Center at Marquette Law School, where we are going to discuss part two of this week's release of new results from a national survey focused largely on the Supreme Court, but also on some non-Supreme Court, at least not directly Supreme Court issues. I'm Alan Borsuk. I'm a senior fellow here at the law school, and joining us is Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Law School Poll. And welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Alan. Good to be here.
This time in the round that was released on Wednesday, July 20th, we focused fairly specifically on the court and on opinions about the court and about decisions, especially abortion-related. This time we're talking more about political fallout, motivation to vote, vote choice related to the abortion issue, salience of abortion in voters' minds, and some other issues like, those January 6th committee hearings and job approval for Joe Biden, whether you want Donald Trump. We got the kind of a range of things here. Let's start with the specifics of the poll.
Sure. So we were in the field. We conducted the poll July 5th through the 12th after the court finished its term. We interviewed 1,003 adults nationwide with a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points. But within that group, we have 853 registered voters with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.3 points. When we talk about motivation to vote and vote choice, we're going to look at registered voters. But when we turn to policy issues on abortion, attention to the January 6th hearings and so on, we'll come back to all adults. So initially, we'll be talking about voter turnout and things related to that for registered voters.
And the registered voters is a somewhat smaller group.
Yes, all adults are all adults 18 and over in the 50 states that we did interviews in. The 853 registered voters are those who tell us that they have indeed registered to vote. Adults can, of course, become registered by Election Day, but one of the strongest predictions of whether you will be registered in the future is whether you're registered today.
We discussed in the first round of these results that approval of the court's work has fallen substantially with strong partisan divides. How does that play out when it comes to opinions and inclinations to vote?
Well, this is, I think, really interesting. In our previous release, be sure and go back and watch it, we found that there were big changes in the way people perceive the court. Approval of the court fell to 38%, down from 44% in May and down from 54% in March. A substantial majority, 64%, say they oppose the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. 36% were in favor of that. But despite all these big changes in perceptions of the court and opinions about the court, today we look for changes in the political ramifications of the abortion decision in terms of, does this motivate one side or the other to be more likely to vote? And surprisingly, in the face of all the changes about the court, our litany today is going to be consistently, we see very little evidence of change since May in who is motivated to vote, who is certain that they're going to vote, which candidates would they choose, and indeed what policies they'd like to see enacted regarding abortion. So if the decision overturning Roe dramatically changed views of the court, we do not find any evidence that it's dramatically changed the electoral landscape for this November.
Let's start looking at that a little more specifically with voter enthusiasm. I think there was some people who were saying Democrats are really going to be motivated to go to the polls to do something about this, and Republicans to defend turf they feel they've gained.
Exactly. And one reason to look at enthusiasm is that it's a pretty good predictor of who actually does vote in November. Not perfect, of course, but it's a good indicator. In July, 45% of registered voters said they're very enthusiastic to vote in November. But that's hardly changed from the 43% that were very enthusiastic in May. Likewise, 65% of registered voters in July said that they are absolutely certain to vote. Notice it's a bigger percentage sure to vote than enthusiastic, so there's some slippage there. But that 65% certain to vote in July was 63% in May. So the idea that the overturning of Roe would suddenly and dramatically change the motivation to vote certainly doesn't work out on the net enthusiasm or the net certainty to vote, which have moved by barely perceptible amounts from May to July.
Does either party have some enthusiasm advantage?
Considerably, Republicans are more enthusiastic than Democrats. 63% of Republicans very enthusiastic to vote, just 45% of Democrats. Now that's up 8 points for Republicans from May and up 3 points for Democrats. But that maintains the Republican advantage and enthusiasm that we in other polls have seen this year. Often the party of the president faces some uphill battles in a midterm election, and that has been clear in not just our polling, but virtually all national polls this year that have shown Republicans enjoying an enthusiasm advantage. But I think our key point is that if the abortion decisions were going to change the elections this fall, you should have seen more of a change in Democratic commitment to voting rather than Republican, and we absolutely don't see that. If we see anything, it's a small, very small gain in the Republican advantage, with both sides up a little bit enthusiasm.
And the measure of are you certain to vote?
Same story. 77% of registered Republicans say they're certain to vote. 72% of registered Democrats say the same. Less, 50% of independents say they're certain to vote. That's pretty typical. But here too, as with enthusiasm, in July, Republicans are 5 points higher in certainty to vote. Democrats are up 2 points since May. So again, the Republican advantage is actually edged up by 3 points, all inside the margin of error, I want to stress. This is the no change story. If there's any change at all, it's very small, but it looks more like a very slight added advantage to Republicans rather than a dramatic change in Democrats' commitment to turn out or be enthusiastic this fall.
You matched up opinions about overturning Roe with enthusiasm to vote.
Yeah.
And you found?
Not much change. Again, with the same Republican advantage. Among those who favored overturning Roe, 60% very enthusiastic. But among those who opposed overturning Roe, only 40% very enthusiastic. And those two numbers are identical to what they were in the May survey. So no change there. What's more, on certainty to vote, of those favoring overturning Roe, 76% certain to vote. Of those opposed to overturning it, 63% certain to vote. So very little change, not quite zero, but very little change on this measure. And again, we see a Republican advantage. Republicans are much more likely to have favored overturning Roe as well. So here, the difference in opinion based on Roe partly masks a partisan difference, but it also demonstrates pretty vividly that being opposed to overturning Roe was not in and of itself enough to eliminate that enthusiasm or turnout gap, and with almost no change from May to July anyway.
How important is the abortion controversy to voters?
Fairly important. 44% say it's one of the most important issues versus 41% in May. Again, inside the margin of error difference, slightly higher, but not something you can be very confident, and certainly not a dramatic change that upends expectations for this year's elections.
And by party affiliation, how important is abortion?
Well, now here we do see an important difference. Democrats rate abortion as much more important than Republicans. 54% of Democrats say it's one of their most important issues. 37% of Republicans say that, but again, with no change since May to speak of. And so Democrats are more concerned about the issue, and that does suggest that it might play a bigger role in their thoughts about the fall election. But as we've already seen, so far at least, that's not translating into shifts in Democrats' enthusiasm or commitment for voting.
If you ask people, who would you vote for? Someone in favor of abortion rights or someone opposed to abortion rights? What do you find?
Well, we find 50% say they would prefer the candidate who supports maintaining access to abortion. 33% say they'd vote for the candidate that would strictly limit abortion rights. And 17% say abortion would not be an issue for them in making that choice. Once more, broken record here, that's not meaningfully changed from where it was in May. So maybe more attention to the issue, maybe a substantial percentage in the mid-40s are very concerned about the issue, but it hasn't changed answers to this question on candidate choice. And one that's a realistic question in the sense that we see such sharp divisions between Democratic candidates and Republican candidates going into the fall, that I think more so than in the past, the abortion issue will divide the parties in terms of their candidates, but it's not clear that it's shifting how people would make vote choices. Also, it's important to recognize that there are many other things that go into the vote choice. Even if abortion is one of the most important, doesn't mean that it's the only issue for the vast majority of voters.
But another spin of the broken record, if you break that down by party affiliation on abortion opinion, what do you find?
The partisan differences you might expect. 62% of Republicans say they'd favor the candidate who would restrict abortions. That might be a little surprising that it's not more than 62%, but it's important to realize that within the Republican Party, at least among voters, there is not quite the unanimity on abortion opinion that maybe candidates have developed. Among Democrats, though, it's 84% of Democrats would favor the candidate who would support keeping abortion legal. Independents are sort of in the middle. 44% would favor the abortion rights candidate. 35% would favor the candidate that would limit. And there, with independents, there is a little bit of change. But in May, 59% of independents supported the pro-abortion rights candidate. That fell to 44% in July, with 35% of independents favoring the candidate who would limit abortion. So still a slight plurality among independents, but not nearly the size of the majority that was there in the May data. So here's a case where there's a little bit of change, or maybe more than a little bit, but it's within just a subgroup of independents. Still worth paying attention to, because it suggests for independents, at least in July, the split on abortion candidates was not as great as it had seemed to be in May.
If you just ask, or let's say apart from partisanship, say what would you like to see as public policy on abortion legality? what do you find and how's it changed?
There's no change yet again. There's still a majority that favor legal abortions in either all or most cases. 28% say abortion should always be legal. 36% legal in most cases. So that's 64% favor some level of legality. 27% say illegal in most cases, and just 8% say illegal in all cases. So we're at 35% on the illegal side. That split from something in the low to mid 60s for some level of legality and something in the mid 30s for not legal is very much in keeping with what we've seen for years on this question, and again reflects no change in policy preferences after the Supreme Court's abortion decision.
And how does that play out in terms of the importance people attach to abortion?
Here it's, I think, kind of interesting. The two extreme groups, the legal in all and the illegal in all, are almost identical in the percent that rate abortion is their most important issue. 63% for legal in all, 64% for illegal in all. For the two groups in the middle, mostly legal or mostly illegal, half as many, 31 or 30%, rate it as the most important issue. So if there's a lot of people in the middle, which there is, those folks are not nearly as likely to say abortion is their top issue. The people at the two always legal or always illegal are perhaps hardly surprising that they think this is a very important issue. But remember, those two groups together are not a majority of the public. And again, not much change.
And when it comes to the partisan breakdown on these things, let me guess, not much change.
Yeah, exactly. A majority, in fact, a solid majority, 2/3, 65% of Republicans say abortion should be mostly or always illegal. 92% of Democrats say it should be always or mostly legal. Among independents, it's 62 legal, 37 illegal. Not much change on that, but you do see this pretty substantial partisan divide, with especially notable that over 90% of Democrats are on one side of this issue, whereas about 35% of Republicans are saying legal at least some, if not all of the time. So there's a little more divide in the GOP than there is among Democrats.
We also asked in this round questions about at what point in a pregnancy do you think abortion should or should not be legal?
Yeah, and here, we're following some recent developments in state legislatures around the country that have sought to ban abortion either before the court's decision or certainly now after. And the question has been framed in terms of when during a pregnancy should a legislature ban abortions. What we find has been pretty consistent. Majorities oppose bans either at any time during a pregnancy, meaning from conception basically, or a majority oppose banning abortion after 6 weeks, similar to the Texas time limit. But it's an even split on abortion bans after 15 weeks of pregnancy. That would be less than in the time when Roe versus Wade was the dominant law, but an even split there. Now, a majority favor bans in the third trimester after 6 months of pregnancy, and a majority also opposes no restrictions on abortion at any time. And so you see some differences here that go from substantial majorities that don't want too restrictive a ban to an even split at 15 weeks to majorities willing to ban abortion in the third trimester or at any time during pregnancy. So where the legislators end up on this issue and how that differs from state to state will be very interesting to watch, because the public has significant variation on what they're willing to accept, depending on how early in a pregnancy that is.
So in the new reality, there is advocacy for banning women from going to other states to get abortions. What's the opinion on that?
Something that the public is very opposed to banning travel out of state for abortions. 78% oppose that, 21% say states should be able to restrict travel for abortions. Those numbers, again, have hardly changed by like a percentage point from a month ago. But here you are seeing really lopsided opinion on this, though it is under active consideration in some states around the country.
And how does that break down in terms of partisanship?
Yeah, here, all partisan groups are opposed to that kind of travel ban, including 69% of Republicans and 80% of independents, 84% of Democrats. So this is an issue where opinion is lopsided and it does cross party lines. Again, we'll see what legislatures decide to do about it, but the public opinion side, at least at this early stage, I think is pretty clear.
There is increased use, even prior to this ruling, of prescriptions to induce an end of a pregnancy. What's the public opinion on, and there's proposals to limit that right?
Right.
Where are we holding on that?
And we asked this question in terms of ordering and filling a prescription from an out-of-state supplier, presumably having the medication mailed to you in a state that otherwise prohibits abortion. 73% oppose states enacting that law to make it illegal to order those drugs from out of state. 58% of Republicans say it should not be legal to do that, to ban that. 73% of independents, 87% of Democrats. So like the travel ban, you see here large majorities that think the state should not limit access either through travel or through prescriptions. And that does cross party lines. Again, we'll see how that holds up over time. But I think we are seeing the conflict between right-to-life positions, which are very strongly held in Republican circles, but infringements on individual liberty to travel or to seek medical prescriptions, and how those conflicts play out over the next few months, or indeed the next few years, is going to be a conflict within especially the Republican Party, where opinion seems to be a little divided on that element.
Speaking of divided opinions, let's turn to some other subjects, starting with the January 6th House Select Committee, which of course has been having spotlighted hearings on what happened that day in terms of the events at the Capitol and Donald Trump's role as the then president. How much awareness is there of that?
A fair bit. These hearings have been on TV in the daytimes and in a few cases at night. 43% say they've heard a lot about the hearings, 38% a little, 19% nothing at all. Over 80% have heard either a lot or a little is fairly high. That said, the 43% that have heard a lot is considerably less than the 81% that have heard a lot about the court's abortion decision. And the court's gun rights decision extending the Second Amendment for carrying a weapon outside the home. 47% had heard a lot about that. So 43% hearing a lot about the House hearings is pretty high, but it's nowhere close to the abortion decision, and it's roughly at parity with the gun rights decision that the court reached.
And One might ask, is there a partisanship breakdown of attention to the hearings?
There is selective attention being a huge element here of who wants to watch the hearings or hear about them. 35% of Republicans have heard a lot, 37% of independents, but 56% of Democrats have heard a lot. Given some of the partisan gaps we see, maybe only a 20% gap is not gigantic here. Some Republicans, over a third, have paid a lot of attention to the hearings. But that said, Democrats are certainly more likely to pay attention.
Overall, or across the whole survey, what do people think about the responsibility Donald Trump had for the events of that day?
52% say Trump bears a lot of responsibility for the violence on January 6th. 18% say a little responsibility, but a pretty substantial 30% say no responsibility at all. Again, a little partisan gap there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just
Wow.
a little bit.
Well, let's look at it first in terms of who's paying attention.
Here, attention to the hearings do matter. 68% of those who've heard a lot say Trump bears a lot of responsibility, versus 40% of those who've heard a little or nothing. We're combining those two categories because those who've heard nothing is pretty small, less than 20%, versus a fair over mid-40s who've heard a lot. So we're splitting the sample that way. So 68 versus 40 is pretty big. That partly does mask partisan differences, though.
And how about them partisan differences?
Well, you won't be surprised that they're sort of substantial. When we break it out by both partisanship and exposure to the hearings, there are big partisan gaps. Somewhere under 20% among Republicans, way up in the 70s and 80s among Democrats. But within party, those who've heard a lot about the hearings are more likely to say Trump bears a lot of responsibility than those who haven't heard much of the hearings. And that's true of Republicans, though most, again, say Trump doesn't bear responsibility. But it's also true of independents, and it's also true of Democrats. So while partisanship still bears the greatest brunt of perceptions of Trump's responsibility, it seems pretty clear that attention to the hearings actually has affected the perceptions of Trump, even controlling for partisanship without dismissing the fact that party plays a big role.
So across the whole survey, what do people think when it comes to whether the evidence that's been presented at this point, there's still at least one more hearing to come as we're speaking, what do they think of whether the evidence is convincing?
It's nearly an even split on this. 52% say the evidence has been convincing, 48% say not convincing. 85% of Republicans say it's not been convincing. There's an even 49 to 50% split among independents, and 83% of Democrats say the evidence is convincing. So this, again, is that powerful orientation of partisanship that makes us either accept the evidence overwhelmingly or dismiss the evidence overwhelmingly. And that's why the previous result I just mentioned, that those who've paid attention do seem a little different than those who haven't paid attention within party, shows that there is a moderate role of being exposed to these hearings, but we shouldn't exaggerate what that effect is, especially when we realize how powerfully partisanship structures our willingness to attend to the hearings, willingness to be convinced by them, and willingness to change our opinions based on the hearings rather than see everything through a partisan lens.
Have the hearings or other recent events changed the overall perceptions of Donald Trump?
Not very much. His favorability rating is hardly changed in the wake of the hearings. Now, again, they're not over yet, but they had been pretty substantial by the time we started the survey. 34% had a favorable view of Trump in July, 35% favorable in May, an barely distinguishable 1% difference could easily be sampling error. Party dominates that, as you would expect, but it doesn't look like exposure to the hearings had any independent effect on favorability, whereas exposure to the hearings did have a little bit to do in seeing Trump as responsible for violence on January 6th.
Trump has been indicating that even fairly soon he'll announce his candidacy for 2024. Yeah. Do people want to see him run?
About the same as in May. Am I a completely broken record yet? 34% would like him to run. 33% said they'd like him to run in May. So again, in terms of the big picture of net effects, very little has changed. Within little categories, we can see some hints of change, but they're not producing big shifts. And Trump's potential to run remains. Solid majorities of Republicans would like to see him run. Solid majorities of the public at large would not like to see him run. But those numbers have really not changed over the last 2 months.
The ratings on Joe Biden's performance as in the job of president are not so cheerful from his standpoint.
No, here we do see some change, and it's not good change from the president's perspective. His job approval fell in July to 36%, down from 42% in May in our national sample of adults. This is the lowest since we've been asking about him beginning in 2021, and follows a sort of steady, if not precipitous, fall over the last year. What we see here with a 6-point decline in approval is in line with approval declines of anywhere from 2 to 6 points in previous 2-month intervals in our survey. But it is definitely the lowest approval rating that we've seen all year.
A couple interesting breakdowns on those numbers. One is bipartisanship, particularly looking at how independents feel about him.
Yeah, independents have fallen to 25% approval in July. They were at 57% in July of 2021, a year ago. Democratic approval has fallen from 96% a year ago to 75% now. 75% is still pretty healthy. But on the other hand, Donald Trump was routinely getting approval from Republicans in the high 80% range. So Biden is underperforming with Democrats a bit there. And Republican approval, not too surprisingly, is at 3% in July. It was a whopping 16% a year ago, but hey, 16% from the other party is pretty good in the modern times. 3% is more like what we've been used to, whether in the Trump era among Democrats or in the Obama era among Republicans, but very dismal ratings there. I think the things to pay most attention to is, it's not surprising with party polarization that Republicans are very negative, but getting 25% approval from any group, and in this case from independents, is a huge challenge to the president and to the party going into the midterm elections.
The breakdown on these results by race and ethnicity is also really interesting.
Yeah, here we see a general decline across racial and ethnic groups. Over the last 12 months, white approval among whites has fallen from 50 to 31%. Among black respondents, it's fallen from 88% to 51%. So still a slight majority, but way down from where it was. Hispanic approval is a little bit more complicated. Their approval among Hispanic citizens has mostly stayed in the mid 50s range, sometimes low 50s, sometimes mid 50s, but not much of a trend. However, in our July data, it fell to 37% approval among Hispanic respondents, a notable drop in the first time we've seen that group's approval fall below 50%. You have to warn that that's one sample that is that low, but it does go with independents being down at 25% and sort of continued but steady decline among other race and ethnic groups.
So again, looking to the big picture, to the overall outlines of this, what's the outlook for this fall and perhaps for beyond?
I think the first thing I would really emphasize is that while the court's decision on abortion dramatically changed how people see the court, we're not finding any evidence that it's really changed the electoral landscape in terms of who's likely to vote, who's enthusiastic about voting, how people would choose between candidates based on abortion. And so there's potential for that to change, but the notion that this was suddenly going to remake the fall election, we just don't see the evidence for. Likewise, the January 6th hearings are having some marginal effects within groups among those who've exposed themselves, have read or heard about the hearings. But those effects, again, are detectable but fairly modest against the force of partisanship. And finally, on this broader picture of how people feel about the country, and specifically about President Biden, the further decline of his job approval ratings is, I think, pretty notable as a challenge for the Democratic Party in general going into the fall elections. We have seen other polling. We didn't ask the question, but about in the elections, would you vote for the Democratic or Republican candidate? That's fairly tight in most polls with a little bit of Republican advantage, but not a lot. So there may be something of a gap between vote choice and Biden approval. But the gloomy state of the country in terms of presidential performance, in terms of the outlook of the economy, in terms of whether you think the country's headed in the right direction or the wrong track, all of those are pretty negative indicators right now. We've got a few months till the election. It does depend on who your actual candidate choices are. And so with primaries not yet complete, we still have to see how some of those general election matchups will be. So the bottom line is there's still the last laps of the race to run here, and I don't think we should pretend that everything is settled at this point. But I also think any notion that the court's abortion decision would suddenly upend all of the dynamics of the election, that we just don't see any evidence for.
Speaking of the primaries, we'll be back fairly shortly after the primaries in Wisconsin on August 9th.
9th it is.
Yes. The high-profile Republican race for a candidate for governor, the high-profile Democratic race for a candidate for U.S. Senate. We'll be back with those results, we expect, in August. I assume we'll be back with a national survey in roughly 2 months. That's the pace we've been doing these. So stay tuned for more. And great thanks to Dr. Charles Franklin for the work on another successful and insightful round of polling. All of the results are available on the Marquette Law School website at law.marquette.edu/poll. And we'll keep slugging ahead to try to provide some insight into what people as a whole are thinking. Thank you for joining us.
See you in a month.
Okay.
See you in a month.